welcome to episode 4. Actually, it's only the 4th episode. It's a new show of the A Stroll Through the Library podcast. And today we've got someone on that I am beyond excited to talk with. Somebody who genuinely, I told my wife the other day, I was like, hey, if you told 15, 16-year-old Matt that he was going to be having this conversation, he would have been psyched about it. So, and I still am today. Super excited to welcome on pastor, author, musician, all-around artist, and everything, Joshua S. Porter. So I wanted to just welcome you on. Thank you for being here, man.
Dude, thanks for having me. The pleasure is truly mine.
Hey, I appreciate it, dude. What do you want to give any introduction of yourself? I mean, I can give it too, but is there anything you wanted to kind of share? I know you've got a new book out we're going to talk about a good bit, but is there anything else you wanted to share with people?
No, I for anyone who might care, or I guess to contextualize the conversation, I played in a band for a million years, and then through a series of unprecedented, or I guess unforeseen circumstances, became a pastor, and I also write books on the side.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, I appreciate it. And you're in Vancouver, Washington, correct?
Yeah, and for
Okay.
the two Vancouvers confuse people, especially since they're relatively close together on a map. But I'm in the Portland, Oregon metro area, which means I'm about 10 minutes across a bridge from Portland, Oregon. Vancouver, Washington is kind of often thought of as the little brother of Portland, Oregon, if that makes sense.
Yep. Absolutely. And you're at Van City Church, which I can only assume is probably named after being in Vancouver City, but I have no idea. So it's cool.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Naming a church, I'm sure you have stories about this. Naming a church is a funny enterprise. It's like everyone has these really specific ideas about what would be incredible and what would be disastrous. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'm convinced it doesn't really matter that much, because after a while, the name of a thing becomes like the wallpaper of the conversation. No one really thinks that much of it. It's called what it's called. And people forget why, or their concern for why kind of lapses out of the conversation. So, but in the beginning, everyone had a lot of thoughts about it. It has to be something like this and this. And I was like, just name it after wherever we're at. Who cares? What difference does it make? It didn't seem to me like an occasion for like advanced creativity. Van City is a lesser used nickname of Vancouver, Washington. It's used more frequently in Vancouver, BC. But I was like, yeah, sure. How about that? That's great. It's just short for Vancouver, the city of Vancouver. That's where we're at. Whatever. To me, it's like practical, less like some kind of poetic. Not that I have any issue with like really creative. Like I hear church names all the time and go, oh man, that's way better.
Yeah. No,
now
I
we
feel
have
that.
we have it. So
We're currently our church is called Kerner Heights Church, not spelled the way that it sounds, which makes it 1,000 times more difficult. And no one knows why. I got here a year and a half ago, and I'm asking, and they're like, "Well, we're not really sure." We come to find out the neighborhood we're in was supposed to be named Kerner Heights. It never happened, but our church was being planted at that same time. So they had the great idea, like, "Hey, we want to be for the community, like similar to you guys, just name it where we're at. Like, that's perfect." And then it never happened. So now we're 60 years
awesome.
removed, and people are like, what the heck is that name? It's like a Catholic last name. What is going on? Like, what is that? Totally different. And then we're Mennonite Brethren, which no one knows what that is either. So that throws a whole nother wrench into things. But with that being said, super glad to have you here, man. I kind of walked you through before we started recording, but for the listeners today, usually, as you've heard in the last couple episodes, I'm asking specifically about books. Joshua wrote a book that I have recommended to about a million people in my lifetime since it's come out, but it's called With All Its Teeth. It's about the death of Christian art, and I think it's an incredible book. If you're somebody who's interested in art, go check it out. You would absolutely love it. But in that book, he talks about movies, music, all of the media. So I've definitely given him free reign. I don't know if you picked any or not, but free and welcome to pick movies, music outside of books as well, but I'll still be asking in kind of the context of books for the podcast. So the first one I got for you, just kind of a warm up question, but it's one that I always really find insightful, which is when you think back to your earliest memory of reading a book, listening to a story, watching a movie, whatever it happens to be for you, what is the one that you just kind of kept coming back to? It stays with you in some way, just kind of childhood side of things.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll preface by saying that, for inside baseball for your listeners, Matt being a responsible and prepared host, he let me in on the kind of trajectory of his show ahead of time. He's like, "Hey, listen,
Yep.
this is kind of how it goes
Try
if
to
you
help
want to think
out.
about it." Yeah, which is really gracious and demonstrates like thoughtful approach to everything. And I bring that up to say that I saw, the general direction of the show, and I was like, "Oh man, that's a really fun conversation." I don't want to make it sterile and boring by premeditating everything I say. So I kind of glanced at it and was like,
Yeah.
"Oh,
Yep.
this would actually be more interesting to answer off the cuff."
Oh, it's perfect,
So
man.
uh, that said, these are semi informed or prepared
Yeah.
responses, or and maybe in some cases not at all. The book thing to me is an appropriate approach to the formation question because, um, yeah, like most people, of course, anybody who appreciates art and entertainment, even people who don't think of themselves as a quote unquote creative type, we we consume a lot of art and entertainment whether we want to or not, or whether we're really intentional about it or not. Everyone probably has a list of like, well, this is the movie that shaped me, or at least changed some dimension of how I think about the world, or I remember being in the theater
Yeah.
and seeing, that kind of experience.
Yeah.
Same thing with records or even television. But books, especially fiction, for me, have been uh, as someone who loves film, as someone who loves music, and I spent most of my, I guess, creative quote unquote career in the music industry. It was fiction that really kind of opened my imagination to creativity in the first place. My mom was a school teacher, and she's really into literature.
Mm.
Uh, and from an early age was like, "Oh, you might like this book," or and push it. And like most, I did not actually take to um, reading, especially long form reading, early on. Like I
Mm.
have kids myself now, and my daughter, she's a voracious reader. She reads chapter books, graphic novels. She'll read them all day long, stacks of them. My son, who's wired a lot like me and who's the eldest, he loves to read and will read a really long book, but only if it absolutely encapsulates his specific interest at that
Hmm.
moment in time. Whereas,
Yep.
my daughter's like, "I don't care. Like it's a book." So she'll just open it and start reading it. And I was more like my eldest son in that, the endeavor of reading just seemed so overwhelming. And it had to like really hone in on my interest until a few works of fiction made me realize that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
The first book for me, honestly, I was 9 years old in fourth grade, and my parents bought me a copy of Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. And this was
Yeah.
before the film was released in 93. So this would have been 1991 or 92, just a year or two after the novel was released. So the people on the other side of, now we think of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World obviously like a global entertainment franchise because it is. But that
Sure.
novel was a huge bestseller at the time without a film adaptation. And in an era where novels were a really important part of the like cultural conversation, they're not anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
sadly. Not
you
quite
know,
as much.
and the movie was in development. It was there was a release date projected by Universal Studios, and my mom was like, "Oh, I read that." She read because Michael Crichton was like, a John Grisham or Stephen King. These are household authors that everyone read. She's like, "I've read it. It's got dinosaurs. You like dinosaurs? You'll probably like it." So she bought me a paperback, like a mass market paperback of Jurassic Park. And I remember the way that it smelled. I remember like the feeling of it in my, like tactile reading is
Yeah.
a really tactile experience. The feeling of
The
like the pages and everything, the like rough, crisp mass market paperback pages.
all the best.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I was like, well, yeah, I was always really into dinosaurs, but I don't know, high science fiction. I wouldn't have had these terms, but I was 9 years old. I was
Sure.
like, I don't
Sure.
know, it's really, look, it's this thick.
Yeah.
Um,
It's the important part at
and
that age.
yeah, yeah, the book opens with this prologue called The Engine Incident that's all about the philosophy of genetics. And so I was
Mm.
almost giving up. But then
Yep.
there's a prologue called The Bite of the Raptor that has a scene that's not in any of the adaptations where a couple discovers the body of their infant in a crib, and there's a small dinosaur on the edge of the bassinet that's eating it.
Yep. Yep.
And it was so horrifying and
Well,
so
yeah.
like vivid and and I was like, what the heck? I don't have no experience with fiction, so I didn't know that something so over the top could be in like a really mainstream. I'm like, well, my mom read this, you know what I
Yep.
mean?
Yep.
And so I read that thing, like I devoured it, and then I started over. I read it again. I had read it twice before the movie came out, uh, and I was like, a lot of it was work for a 9-year-old, and certainly the higher concepts were completely lost on me. But I really tracked with it. I was like, I could
Well,
see
yeah.
it, and that was my first then experience of watching a film adaptation of a novel. Which people who love novels and see movies, of course, we're always the buttheads that are like, oh,
Yep.
the book was
Yep.
better and all that crap.
Yep.
But it's also a really like incredible experience to see something that you love
Yes.
adapted, especially in the semi-rare occasions in which they're adapted in such a way where it's great. You know
Yep.
what I mean? And
Yep.
Jurassic Park was one of those occasions. Um, and so that was my first novel
Yeah.
experience, but that was really locked into like my niche interest. And so it was kind of like a downstream thing, it's like an easy
Sure. Sure.
sell. There's
Yep.
violence, there's dinosaurs, there's
Yep.
mayhem.
Yep.
And then, so that was when I was ninth grade, and then when I was in junior high, we were forced to read Dickens' Great Expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And on paper, this is a freaking boring book. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that comes to the chagrin of people who really love Dickens, and it's like, yeah, sure,
Sure.
whatever, Dickens.
But still,
Uh,
yeah, it's
yeah,
true.
when you're in eighth grade or something like that, and you're like, what? So there's this kid, and he has a benefactor, and he likes this girl. I don't know. It's just like, and it's really Victorian sounding, and but I got to read it for this class, and so I kind of engaged it, thinking I would just go through a superficial level of attention in order to get through it, and I found myself really engaged in Great
Yep.
Expectations.
Yep.
Um, to this day, like it's not that the book itself made a huge impact on me. I don't really remember much about Great Expectations in the specific sense the way I do with something like Jurassic Park,
Yeah.
but that was the experience anyway that made me go, oh, you don't even necessarily have to uh, find some kind of like connection to the idea of the book or the plot, the story, the genre of the book. A great book can just be a great book, like in
Yeah.
the writing, the style, the immersion of the experience, all that. And that was so. Then after that, I was more open to novels in general. It was after Great Expectations, even though it was fine. Like I just remember finishing
Yeah.
and being like,
Yep.
oh, I actually kind of, I guess I enjoyed that. Opened me up to reading stuff that on paper I might have been like, it doesn't really sound like the kind of thing I might like, but I'll give it a shot, and you find a lot
Totally.
of great fiction that way. And then that led me into, when I started to read more, it was my mom who gave me the two books that made the biggest, probably creative impact on me were one was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, her only novel, and then Kafka's The Metamorphosis.
Yep.
Um, and those were the two, and those are like, high school curriculum books or SAT question books that have their place in the literary pantheon for sure. And they sound like, oh yeah, of course Sylvia Plath. But for me, the Sylvia Plath book was like, it's like a descent into insanity. The story of the bell jar. But kind of subtle, it doesn't go bananas by the end of the book. It's just kind of this woman, the narrator. she declines as you continue to read the book, and in really subtle ways at times. And I thought, like, oh man, what an incredible, I didn't know that you could do that with fiction, that you could, like, the
Absolutely.
voice of the narrator itself is the vehicle through which the reader, like, is brought into this decline. There's no
Absolutely.
omniscient third person saying, then she did this and she was
Yeah.
crazy. You know what I
Yep.
mean? You
Yep.
experience it through her, the vehicle of her voice. And then the metamorphosis and the rest of Kafka's work was just kind of like, what? Like the conceit of the novella, it's really tiny. You can read it in a couple of sittings, if not one sitting, is just that there's a traveling salesman. He wakes up one morning and for reasons unbeknownst to him or anyone else, he's transformed into like a human-sized cockroach in his bed. And then what would that be like? It's really isolating and painful and like,
Yeah.
but why? And the idea that such a prominent literary figure, it's like, I don't really care why, it doesn't matter. It's just,
Yep.
it's a bizarre scenario that is just designed to as a means to talk about a sense of isolation or distance from your own family and loved ones. But to me, aesthetically, I was just like, the idea of just paragraph one, sentence number one, one morning, Gregor Samsa woke, from unsettling dreams to found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. And you're like, what? And that's it. And you go from there. That really informed me creatively to like, oh, you can do that. You can do that kind of thing, especially with fiction and the written word. Um, and the experience of the voice, the style of writing, not necessarily, all that to say, this is a really long answer, but going from something really plotted and kind of mainstream pacing like Jurassic Park, which I love, huge, inspiration, but it's like that's a quintessential like airport, page turner. It's designed to be
Absolutely.
one,
Yeah.
to something more classic, like, Dickens, and then into the weirder realms of classic literature, contemporary and modern, together, I guess, taught me a lot or shaped my experience of like, man, there's so much that you can do in fiction or in writing that you can't do in any other form of
Yeah.
like creative storytelling or in art. And so that was always what I wanted to do most, was to write. It's always what I liked doing most was writing. And because of, a handful of books that you can plot along a timeline, and there've been, a ton of others that have had huge impact, but those are like the seminal, it was
Yeah.
this one to this one to these, you know what I mean?
No, no, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, I think in the last episode I put out, I told our last guest, but I said my childhood book, like the one that I read the most, and there were a few of them, but the one that really got me for some strange reason was the Series of Unfortunate Events were like brand new at that point, because that's about the time that I was growing up, and it was so funny to me because I think in retrospect the reason I loved them so much was because the narrator himself is not a trustworthy narrator. Like, you can tell from the very opening of the pages, there's something off about this guy who's telling me these 13 books, like this entire series of things, and I kind of want to know like why and how, because yeah, especially when you're a kid, you're like, well, I'm supposed to just believe what I'm being told, but then you're reading a book and you're like, there's some cracks in this guy's like
Yeah.
statements and something's going on. And it really did. It was funny because in the last episode I was saying it's fun that when you're a kid, you kind of try to, at least for a lot of people, books are like a way to escape from regular life, even if it's good. I mean, I had a good upbringing, but still, like, it was a respite from whatever else was going on, and I
Yeah,
appreciated that
totally.
element. But it's funny because it's like I don't have anything that I can relate to, like being an orphan whose parents have died or any of these things. Like, reading the story, there should be no reason I'd enjoy this. But then you get into it and you're like, wait a minute, okay, I've got that. And as you progress reading and get through that, yeah, I think there's something, I don't know, one of the interesting points that actually I didn't write this one down as a question, but I was just kind of interested in the conversation around was, for me, I had not watched hardly any horror movies in my life. Very, very, very few of them. I've seen the classics and I've seen Annabelle and whatever else. But like I became a youth pastor at 18 and I was like, man, I can't watch horror movies. I'm in like a kind of pseudo Southern Baptist circle and that's just not appreciated, all that jazz. And then for better or for worse, I would say for better. But after reading With All Its Teeth a while back, I jumped into watching shoot, what was the movie? The R.A. Aster
Is it
his
Hereditary?
yeah, Hereditary. Watched Hereditary due to just kind of how you were explaining it. And I was like, my wife's not going to watch it with me. I know that. But I'll try to watch it and it's free on Tubi or whatever. So download that, watch it. And oh my goodness, watching that movie just truly, I was like, I totally get and agree with kind of the thought behind there are plenty of people who I can't tell go watch this movie, and that's totally fine. There's different levels to things. And don't take this for anyone listening as a broad stroke, go watch the movie. Maybe not. But for me, I really do think watching it, I was like, there is things happening within the genre of horror that just kind of can't happen in a drama or a comedy or a whatever else. There's so much more going on with emotion and feeling. And I think for me, books have always been that space. I've been less of a movie guy throughout my life, but books and music for me have always been that thing where there's some other element of conversation that can be brought in. There's some other underlying tone, and you can't always like quite know when you start where the thing is going to end up. And in movies, usually, unfortunately, 90% of the time, my wife loves to watch a lot of like Hallmarky type movies, and you can kind of tell immediately where the plot's going to end. With those, you really can't, and it's something I appreciate about that. Back to the childhood book story side of things, though, I was kind of wondering what's going on as you're reading Jurassic Park. Like, what's going on personally in your life at that time? Like, what's your childhood look like, and how was life going when you encountered those books for the first time?
It was great. You know, I have probably the same quibbles and the same joys of anyone with a relatively tragedy-free upbringing.
Yeah,
And by that,
yeah,
I mean, I don't mean to paint it as if there was never any conflict or pain,
sure, sure.
because those are, you know, essential to the human experience. But
Yep.
all things considered, it was um, a relatively easy upbringing in that great. I had a great family and parents who now, you know, like I could see to a certain degree then, but now can really see that I didn't make things easy for them. I'm very like wired for rebellion kind of, and especially in adolescence and asking questions. And even though like my tastes were really unconventional, even as like a young person who was interested in following Jesus, I was raised by Christians and in the church. Um, and I didn't start to ask those questions about the legitimacy of Christianity until late adolescence, early adulthood. So into my like teenage years when I discovered punk rock music um or horror movies or started to read transgressive literature. It was as someone who was, you know, like fun I was a Christian but didn't have any kind of like I'm trying to, you know, edge out of my upbringing or anything like that.
Sure, sure.
They were just kind of my like aesthetic preferences. And I was raised in kind of like a very conservative corner of rural Southeast Georgia in a Southern
Oh
Baptist
man. Okay.
context. And so,
Yep.
even like, the idea of, oh, I kind of like these horror movies or just, you know, like strange art in general and punk rock music was like deeply concerning to the adult world of my upbringing. And my parents, I mean, they've certainly had pushback on certain things and they didn't like certain things. But for the most part, we're like, yeah, I mean, you seem like, you know, uh, like you seem to be able to make sense of these things in a way that doesn't completely terrify us all the time, and so they were really supportive when I, wanted to make music of my own, even though that was really always an unconventional
Sure.
endeavor. And even though like myself and my brother and my friends, we did not look like our peers in Southeast Georgia, especially when we discovered like the punk rock aesthetic, and they were like, "Oh man, your hair looks dumb," but they, like they didn't like a mohawk, really? Why?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Um, but
What's
they
that
weren't
about?
like, "Oh my gosh, what are we?" It was so there was the ordinary push and pull that all adolescent kids that's experimenting with rebellion go through with their parents, but um those things I feel now really grateful that, from both sides of my parental kind of upbringing, I was being nurtured rather than stifled in, creativity. There were, certain pieces of art that meant a lot to me that they, for years couldn't wrap their mind when I first heard, the Nine Inch Nails record, The Downward Spiral in 1994, that was maybe the most inspirational record or like, one of the most aesthetically inspiring things that, of my entire life, and from the first listen, like, sitting down and listening to it start to finish in one sitting was like, "Oh, everything that I think about music and art and expression has been changed in the runtime of this record." And that was something that they were like, "This is nuts, like, this is too far," which in a lot of ways is completely understandable
Sure.
from
Sure.
their perspective.
Yep.
But, as a kid, my dad, he was an old '70s rocker guy, and he played, Queen's A Night at the Opera for me and my brother when we were young, and we were like, "We need to make a rock band," you know what I mean? And he
Yeah.
bought
Yeah.
me my first Aerosmith record on cassette tape, and my mom was giving me books by Kafka and Sylvia Plath, and not and it wasn't any kind, it was just like that was the environment of, we'd be like, "Dad, this," like, "Can I hold your Aerosmith tape?" And he'd be like, "Ah, okay, don't tell your mom I let you,"
Yep.
and and then my mom would sit down after we'd read these weird books and be like, "What'd you think?" And we'd talk about it in a normal way. So even though there was all the normal stuff of domestic,
Sure.
families and the, 80s and 90s, that overall it was a good place to explore, creativity and the arts and entertainment. Our family, my dad took us to the movies, all the time. When we got a little older and got because our family was like one of those no R-rated movies, Southern
Oh, yeah.
Baptist
Yep.
families.
Yep.
My dad's rule was no R-rated movies unless they have Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Well, I mean,
Um,
that's a fair rule, but
I agree,
just
yeah, and that was honestly formational, being, like, so those were my first R-rated movies, but when they got older and, like, some formational memories I have of seeing, like, David Fincher's film Seven for the first time in the, late '90s, like, that was with, like, my mom and some friends, and we were all like, "Oh,
man.
that was so cool," you know what I
Yep.
mean? So it was, like, definitely, in many ways, stereotypically conservative Southern Christian family, apprehensive of arts and entertainment, like, D&D is the
Sure.
devil or something
Yep.
like that.
Yep.
But then in a lot of ways, broke that mold, pretty, uh, adamantly with, the inclusion of rock music or films or novels, so I can't complain. It was a good environment to get into stuff.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I very similarly uh grew up Southern Baptist-ish is what I always say because we were at a non-denom church most of the time, but surrounded by Southern Baptist culture. And there was the joke at the time, and I still believe it to be somewhat true, but at least in Maryland and Pennsylvania, the joke is that a non-denominational church is just a Southern Baptist church with a cool website. And that was kind of accurate. We were like trying to be
Cool
cool.
website's not nothing.
I was gonna say it, but nowadays I'm not even sure. But no, I remember like kind of being it. I shared a while ago, but it's always interesting to think through because I remember like Pokemon cards, absolute no go, not allowed to happen. Too far. D and
Devil, yeah,
D,
demons for
too
sure.
far. Like all of that. But then like 5 years old, I'm sitting on the couch with my dad, and he was like, "Hey, have you watched Silence of the Lambs?" And I was like, bro, where would I have watched it? I'm with you. Like, I'm 5, but sure, like, let's watch it. And so, like, just a strange and a good one, honestly. I'm very grateful. But like when I would go to the mall and go into the music section, like I could kind of pick up anything. I remember one of the first albums I bought was An Ocean Between Us, As I Lay Dying album, like early 2000s. I remember that was like the first one I had made my money. I'm going in and I'm buying it myself and picking up that record, like thinking I'm probably gonna have to, like, I don't know why, but just kind of felt like I had to hide it from my parents because it's like a little too far. There's like skulls on the cover and we're homeschooled. You're not allowed to do that. Like that whole deal. But my parents being like, yeah, it's awesome. Like, we don't get it. Trust me. Like, my dad's a huge Striper fan.
Right on.
So he was there, but he also took me to metal shows and took me to all of that stuff. Actually, I think in retrospect, and just a fun fact, but do you know, during the 90s and early 2000s, there was the I can't recall what it was called, but it was those posters that were put up in like every youth room in a church in America with like, do you like this band? Secular band, listen to this one instead. They, whatever organization that was, sent out your guys' ShowBread CD. And I recall my dad playing that as our youth pastor growing up. And I was like, dude, like, this is awesome. Like, that type of stuff he was totally cool with, but still didn't quite understand it. But I appreciated the willingness to dive into that and get connected with all of that. And so it's always interesting to me to hear kind of just how people were formed, because I think it does shape the rest of ministry and the way that we write, the way that we do things. So I appreciate it, man. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's
Um,
hilarious. I mean, those charts were the best. It was because one of those charts that my brother and I discovered authentic punk rock, because
but yeah.
in the late 90s there was a revival of skate punk at
Hmm.
like a mainstream level, in particular with the Green Day record Dookie
Yep. Yep.
and the Offspring record Smash, which Smash was still on Epitaph Records, like the
Yeah,
indie punk rock label, but
they
the
were
the
doing it.
videos from Smash were on MTV, and like that was a multi-platinum album
But
that
yeah.
they made for like a couple $1,000, in California or whatever. And so, my brother and I is like getting into alternative music because of MTV and into like the first Weezer record or Flaming
Yeah.
Lips, and then all of a sudden Pavement. Now Green Day and Offspring are part of this conversation, and we really loved those records. Went to a youth camp. There's a chart. It's like, hey, if you like Green Day and Offspring, you should try MXPX. And at
Yeah.
the time, there were only, I think, 2 records out, and one was the Poking the debut Pokinatcha, and then Teenage Politics was the follow-up. And so we're like, "Okay, sure," and our parents were so happy that we were like, "Can we get these albums? They're at the Christian bookstore." And they were like, "Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll get them for you." And so we put on the MXPX records, and we're like, "Dude, these are way harder and faster than the Green Day record." And, I've told this story a lot, but inside the liner notes of the Pokinatcha record, the guys from MXPX, like one guy's wearing like a NoFX t-shirt, another
Oh,
guy's wearing
yep.
like a Rancid t-shirt,
Yep.
and my brother and I actually went out to the record store and he bought a NoFX record, I bought a Rancid record, just based on those
Oh,
t-shirts,
no,
because we're like, I've
100%.
never heard
Yeah.
of that. They're obviously bands,
Yep.
but if these guys like them, it's probably within that same vein. And so the solution to the secular punk rock
I-
music actually inadvertently brought us in deeper into like authentically
Yeah.
indie punk rock music. And that was our gateway into that world, was through that chart to MXPX back into, like something way more off the beaten path than Green Day or Offspring. So
I think that
thank
is
God for those charts.
amen. Yeah, I agree. I think that's not a singular experience. I think I've heard that from quite a few people. I know guys I grew up with who are looking at it and they're like, okay, like I legitimately know who like Jeremy Camp is because I'm in church, but like who are they comparing him to? Which was, by the way, never accurate on that one, but
Yeah, of
that's a
course.
whole different story. But
Somebody
when
who had no idea actually
yeah,
made that
it's
spreadsheet, yeah.
usually the case. Yeah, but that's all right. They're like, "Do you like NoFX? You're gonna love Reliant K." And I was like, "Well, I
Yep,
mean, like,
yep. It's like,
not
well, I mean,
quite." Like, I don't mind either, but that they're different for sure.
and but people don't realize that, as dumb as that sounds, and as well intentioned as I'm sure that
Yeah, no,
endeavor was,
absolutely.
uh, there was a time in the '90s and early 2000s where there was a depth of originality in really like underground Christian
But yeah,
music,
yep.
especially because of probably in a singular sense Tooth and Nail Records. But when I was like in junior high and saw one of these charts for the first time at a Southern Baptist youth camp or whatever it was, there was a if you like Nine Inch Nails, then try Chatterbox, which was a
Oh
Tooth and
man,
Nail,
yeah, yep,
kind of industrial metal outfit that was inspired by, industrial bands like Ministry. And as a kid, like, who was just, like, really into goth industrial music, and I listened to all this really obscure, and transgressive industrial music. I'm like, "Fine, whatever, I'll buy the Chatterbox record," thinking that it was gonna be some kinda dorky
I,
Christian substitute, and it
yep.
was really, like,
No, it's
sincere, like, industrial music with a
incredibly,
lot of
yeah,
integrity, and I was like, "Oh, dude, this is really actually cool," and now and that record those records like that remain kind of obscure and off the beaten path, uh, so, I mean, it's kinda like that I do the same thing today on my phone on Apple Music by just opening up a record and starting to, like, dive similar artists,
yep,
and just
yep,
based on album covers and, like, whatever, the avatar of the band on
yeah,
Apple Music. So I'm like,
yep.
"Oh, that's kinda interesting. What does this sound like?" And hitting play. So we're effectively still looking for those, like, if you like, then try.
No,
I
absolutely.
appreciate those algorithms.
I do, yeah, I do too. I think it's fun though. Like, I don't. I was talking with a friend a couple weeks ago, and well, I'll jump back into book stuff in a moment. But talking with a friend a couple weeks ago, and I was like, man, the funniest thing to me is the idea that like when you would buy a record, you'd sit. I remember like even if I didn't like it in the first 30 seconds, first minute of a song, like I've dedicated $20 and I went to the mall and I picked out this, like I'm gonna find a reason to like this as best I physically can. Whereas now, like the unfortunate reality is like a song plays, I try not to do it, but I'm 30 seconds in and I'm like, nah, kind of lost interest, skip to the
Yeah.
next one. And so there's an element I do miss about like sitting, looking through the liner notes versus you don't get liner notes on Apple Music, sadly. I wish, but but yeah, still I still
Yeah,
open
I
and look,
agree. Yeah,
read
it's
the lyrics.
and I'm the same way. Like, I had the same experiences of you buy often a record based on one song that was in rotation on the radio or on MTV if you're old, um, and then, feeling as if, like, I've invested in this
But yeah,
project,
yep,
and so now it's my responsibility to find something in it that, if it doesn't jump right out of your radio, it's like, "Oh, man, this is ama," and a lot of records did, like, the records
yep,
I've been talking about, those it wasn't hard to like something like Smash or Dookie or the first Weezer record, but then, you'd buy a lot of, uh, I guess, weirder stuff or stuff that you're like, that's kinda cool, and it's stuck in my head now, so I'll give it a shot," and then you buy the record and you're like, "Well, that was clearly just the single, but by God, I'm gonna try to like it," and sometimes found that you couldn't and sometimes found that you could. Um, but yeah, like we're in a world saturated, inundated with options, and realistically, it's not something that you can do is give every new record that you have instant
no, no,
access to an honest listen. So, I mean, and now I've had lots of experiences where a friend will be like, "Hey, have you heard this album?" And I'll say like, "Yeah, I started it and it didn't sound like it was my thing, so I turned
yep,
it off." And they'll be like, "Oh, you should listen to it again." And then I'll go, "Oh, okay." And then find that they're right. You're like, "Oh, yeah, if
absolutely.
I would have made it to the third song, I would have
Gonna
converted
press
over
on,
the
yeah,
runtime of the album." But,
yep.
it's like
It's the
we've
instant
only got so much time.
gratification.
How many
Yeah, yeah. Also that is true. Yeah. So back into book questions, one that I'm super interested in. But what is a book? Is there any book that you return to over and over again, keep coming back to in your life? Uh, Maybe seeing it in a different way, but just kind of returning to it.
Yeah, there's a handful. And I think it's like there's only so many books that I've willingly, especially works of like long form fiction that I've read more than once. Even books that I really loved, you
Yeah.
usually kind of go like, "Wow, that was amazing," and it's not that you're opposed to reading it again; it's just not something that
Yeah.
happens.
Yep.
Especially, I usually like I have a novel going all the time, whether it takes me forever because I'm busy or I read it in a couple days. And so bringing in an old one, it's
Yeah.
kind of like it has to be the right circumstances. So it's rare, but there are a handful of novels that I've read and reread. One of them is a novel called Geek Love by Catherine Dunn.
Okay.
That's about a traveling circus sideshow in which a husband and wife intentionally take experimental drugs during pregnancy to populate the carnival with their own freak show.
Oh man.
Um, it's a very, very weird book,
Sure.
um, but it is, in terms of like a style and form, it's kind of one of and I read it as an adult, a book that was like, well, forget it. I don't want to write anymore.
Yep.
She's already
Yep.
done the best that you can do. And so I've read it, I think 3 or 4 times now, but every few years as a writer, will be like, I'm going to reread Geek Love for inspiration.
That's cool. I haven't heard of that one. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, you might like it. It's wild, and Catherine Dunn, that's kind of like her landmark novel, and she's not known for much else. She wrote a couple of books that are not nearly on the to her, what she would argue is not are not on the level of Geek Love. Then she took like a 10-year break, published Geek Love, and then kind of didn't do much else until she died just a couple of years ago. And Another novel is one that is something that I've only read in the last decade, and that's a book by an author called Donald Ray Pollock. He wrote a novel called The Devil All the Time,
Mm.
which maybe some people are more familiar with now because it was adapted into a Netflix film
Oh, okay.
a few
Gotcha.
years
Gotcha.
ago, and it has Tom Holland. It has Spider-Man in it.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and the adaptation's fine, but the novel is kind of this. Flannery O'Connor was another really massively influential writer for me as a writer. When I first got into writing fiction, an older person that I knew read something I had written and says, "Oh, it sounds like you kind of write along the lines of Southern Gothic genre." And
Yep.
I was like, "I don't know what that is."
Yeah.
And and they were like, "Well, you should read Flannery O'Connor. And if you would like to read someone who is doing what you're attempting to do, which is to tell these stories that feature like the bizarre or the grotesque, but in order to make a spiritual point about like God and the world, then Flannery O'Connor is the greatest writer to ever attempt something along those lines." So I went and got like the complete works of Flannery O'Connor and, and read that. And so Donald Ray Pollock work is like an evolution of Flannery O'Connor. But he ratchets up the intensity.
Okay.
Whereas Flannery O'Connor prefers, in some cases, subtlety. She's certainly not afraid to provoke or to be
Yeah.
obscene, but not to the degree that a work like The Devil All the Time, which the name kind of indicates where the tone of the book, but it's this work of fantastic Southern Gothic writing that uh, it might be my favorite novel of all time, and it's a novel that I've only read in the last decade, and I've read it 3 times. And it's one of those books that people who love books will understand this. Like you read every book you read, you're hoping it's gonna be amazing. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Like even if
Yep.
it starts off and you're like, oh, it's all right, and then you read it and you're like, it was pretty cool. My wife, she reads at a level that is like embarrassing to me. It's like she literally read close to 200 novels last year.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
She reads several every single week, and she just Then she picks up another stack from the library and she reads through all those. And she and I were laughing because, I feel like I read a lot of novels, nothing compared to her. But she reads a ton of novels, and most of those are fiction. And
Yeah.
she's like, the majority of books you read are bad. You know what I mean? Like if you read that
Yep.
many books, she's like, a lot of them are stinkers. Even if you finish them, and most of the time we both finish them, like it would have to be just atrocious not to at least try
Yeah.
to get to the end of it. Cause you
Yep.
don't know, it could turn around. And I have had books that shift around the halfway point and you're like, oh, I wasn't into it. Now I'm into it. She's like, yeah, you start every one of them hoping it's going to be a 5-star, like, oh man, it was so good. And unfortunately, most of them aren't. And that book, The Devil All the Time, it was recommended by another author that I really love. And I was about to go on vacation, so I was like, I'll go get this from the library. And it was like the name of it, the cover of it, everything was lined up for it to be awesome. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
this is going to be a good one. I read the first page and I'm like, oh, it's already so good. But part of you anticipates it's going to collapse. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like it can't
You're
stay.
waiting for it. Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
Yep.
like it'll start amazing and then it'll probably end up being like decent.
Yep.
And that's better than bad. Decent
Yep.
is better
Yeah.
than bad.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, but this was one of those experiences. I don't mean to oversell it. It's just
No,
my
no.
personal preferences. This experience was like, I didn't want it to end, and then when I finished, I was, like reading Geek Love, was just like, oh, dude, forget it. This guy, he's done it. I don't have anything else to contribute to the world of fiction. So yeah, there's a handful of books that I like to, and usually if I'm writing fiction or nonfiction, I pick 2 or 3 works of fiction and then have them on my desk beside my little typewriter, and we'll begin writing sessions by reading a few pages of the books that I've chosen because it helps, like get into the voice of whatever you're writing or
Absolutely.
inspire the voice of what you're writing.
Now, do you write on a typewriter?
Well, I do, but it's like a
Oh, okay.
gimmicky,
Sure.
electronic
That's
typewriter. It's one of these like distraction-free devices.
yeah.
Which,
Yep.
it was given to me as a birthday gift, and then I actually found that I really enjoyed writing that way. So it's like an electronic word processor as opposed to like a laptop.
That's awesome. No, I've thought about it, but I haven't done that. I've written let me think, written 3 books, and all of them just Google Docs and Word, and then there's a notification that pops up in the corner and you get distracted for 15 minutes and kind of stinks. So I've thought about it, but I haven't moved that way yet.
Yeah, it's like
Now,
there's,
yeah, yeah,
good and bad things about both. It's like, 'cause I also find that when I'm writing, I gotta look crap up all the time.
yep,
You know what I
yep,
mean?
yep.
So usually if I'm writing on that typewriter out and about somewhere, I'll be like, make a note in the journal beside it, fact check this or look up the reference to this. So yeah, I use both.
No, that's awesome, man. That's cool. Well, I'm gonna shift the conversation just a little bit, because I'm kind of interested as your newest book, How to Die, is out now. I think it came out like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, somewhere in that range. And I was telling you before we started recording, but this is literally, and I'm not just saying this because you're on here, but genuinely one of the best books I've read in a long time. And I know that that's like nobody wants to hear that straight to their face, but we also do, but it's a whole different thing. It's like the reality of it. Just an incredible book. I can't tell people enough. You really do need to check it out. But the title, How to Die, I am interested because I get it, but interested so everybody else can hear too. My daughter walks in the room. She's 6, and she walks up to me and she said, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, it's How to Die." She said, "The cover's really pretty. I've got it right here. It is a cool, super cool cover right there."
Yeah, it's great.
And my daughter walks in. She said, "The cover is pretty." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "What's it called?" And I said, "How to Die." And she goes, "What? What are you reading? Like, what is that?" And so death kind of, it is and it isn't a theme. I was trying to explain the book, and I know I've got the guy on here to explain it, so I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. But I was trying to explain it to one of our interns here at church, and I was like, it doesn't really fit the mold of really any other book I've ever read, and that's good. That's a good thing. But there's moments of very poetic nature. There's moments that are more narrative. There's I hesitate to say fiction, but somewhat like historical fiction based on the Bible, and then genuine just like discipleship. It's not really an essay. It's very different from other stuff, but beautiful and intriguing. Really draws you in. Now in the book, like I said, it's called How to Die. I think it's both like a jarring and intriguing title. I'm sure that's part of the reason of going for it. But as you talk about dying in the Christian life, what exactly do you mean by that? I'll just kind of throw a softball over there. But what do you mean by that? And why do you see this kind of death as essential to discipleship?
Well, part of it, quite frankly, is I'm a titles kind of guy. I think titles are kind of a twofold in the world of publishing and the marketing department of publishing. Certainly, there are other concerns to titles, concerns like marketability, and with that clarity. And I don't mean to say that like publishers never want good titles, but there
No,
are
no, I
certain
get that
terms,
though.
and all my friends, that have written books and in the publishing world, most of them have told me stories about like, well, it was called this, but then the publisher told me like, it would actually market a lot better if we could put this word in the title, or if we
Yeah,
could make it sound more like this. You know what I mean? Um, and I and I have a lot of friends who are like, they're like, that's fine, I don't care. But to me, titles are a part of the aesthetic experience of the book. You know what I mean? I think of titles, chapter titles, section titles, and then the first and last lines of the whole book to me are the most important kind of
absolutely.
components of the overall like aesthetic experience, making something that's cohesive and moves from the
Yeah.
beginning to the end. And so I like provocative title. That sounds like a little pretentious, but I like titles
No,
that are
no.
kind of like would make someone go like, "Whoa, what in the world is that?"
Yep.
As like an enjoyer of writing and fiction, like I liked titles. I brought up Donald Ray Pollock earlier, but a title like "The Devil All the Time" isn't
Yeah.
to me, and they're like, "Oh, that's really interesting." It seems to imply something sinister, but it does it, and and why? Um, Great titles, and that title occurred to me before I'd written anything. It was always the name of the book. It had different subtitles along the
Yeah.
journey,
Yeah.
but I always wanted it to be called How to Die. And one of my first conversations with the publisher was honestly like, "Do you care if we call it that?" Because usually the conversation will come back around at the end, and they'll say like, "Now about the title." The same thing happened with a book I'd written called Death to Deconstruction, where there was like a conversation at the end prior to publishing where the publisher was kind of like, "Can we call it anything else?" I think it's like it's too confrontational. It's too um it's it'll rub the audience the people that you want to read it will be put in a defensive posture, and then they won't want to read it. And my response to that was like, I think that that's part of the like aesthetic experience of reading, is to be put in to have like your hackles raised when you go into it, and to be provoked. And I think that's kind of interesting. I like art that does that to me. I like,
Absolutely.
as like a teenager listening to the Marilyn Manson record, Antichrist Superstar, as a Christian, I thought that I was like, "Oh, what does that mean? That's interesting." And then I'm listening to this like really furious critique of essentially like political evangelicalism, and going like, yeah, that's kind of fair,
Yep.
but whatever. I
Yep.
disagree with this." And so I kind of assume, for better or for worse, it's like people are autonomous and they can read it and they can get mad if they want, or they could read it and go like, "Oh, well, I disagree with this. I agree with this
Yeah.
part." And then come to their own conclusions. And I'd rather entrust that responsibility over to the reader than trying to cater it in such a way as to like handle them with kitty gloves. Um, and so the conversation about How to Die came up in the beginning, and we're like, "Do you care if we call it that?" And they were like, "Yeah, it's probably fine." and
Yep.
they were wonderful. I mean, like I worked
That's
with David
awesome.
Z. Cook, and
Yeah.
it was an amazing experience. At the end of the experience, it came up again, and they were like, should we put a word like, or should we put the words to self at
Yep.
the end? How
Yeah.
to die to
Try to
self.
soften, round that out a
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
yeah, and I
Yep.
mean, like, because they
Sure.
understood that that's essentially the sentiment of it's taken from or adapted from a Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote that's the epigraph at the very beginning of the book, which is when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And then the book that follows is how to die. So basically, how to be a Christian. But I like that word picture. I like the imagery of, Jesus, take up your cross and follow me. And I wanted to like reinfuse the prerequisites in Jesus. That's the prerequisite to discipleship, not like come and follow me and then eventually you're going to have to die. But his whole thing is like take up your cross and then come and follow me.
Yep.
And, that language has been appropriately romanticized in the church, understandably, but it's also become deeply familiar to Christians. And so I liked the idea of trying to re-energize the original subversiveness of like what a jarring thing that would have been to hear in the first century, take
Yeah.
up your cross and follow me. It's like, ugh, I don't like the sound of that. And I think How to Die, in a sense, does that effectively. I've heard lots of stories like one of the overseers or elders of my church is a woman who's in her 70s, and she had a copy at her house. And her daughter came over to visit and was like, "What is this?" She thought
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
like some kind of like end of life,
Oh no.
like guidebook. And so, and lots of, I sent one to my spiritual director, and he'd text me when he came in the mail and was like, I mean, I know I'm not always like in great shape, but I think I got some fight left in me.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I
I think I like it. In simplest terms, it's just the invitation to discipleship. I was just trying to reinvigorate or like invigorate once again how provocative it is in the language of Jesus himself. The whole like take up your cross is essentially like come and die, as Bonhoeffer put it.
no.
So
I love it, man. Yeah, I was reading a study a while ago. They were talking about people who put stickers on their laptop, and that's a whole weird conversation there, but they're talking about like the reality that people will put stickers on their laptop to sit at a coffee shop and wait for people to come up to them. And I was like, well, I admittedly have multiple stickers on my laptop, and half the time that I'm sitting drinking coffee, I'm not really opening the invitation for others to come out. I mean, if it happens, like I'm a pastor, but like that's not my goal. And then this study went on to talk about tattoos. And if you have tattoos, that's something that a lot of times people use as like a conversation starter. And I was like, man, again, I just like tattoos, dude. Like, I don't know what to say. Now, this book, I did say to someone the other day, I was like, I love genuinely the fact that if I go sit and I read this, drinking a latte somewhere, that people are either going to be deeply concerned as they look over and see the title, or they're going to come start a conversation and ask, like, what on earth is that about? And I think it was the right call because, yeah, I think if it said how to die to self, it would probably soften that a little too much. So I
yeah,
appreciate it. I was just interested because I think that's a helpful piece of that story for people listening as well. Now, the thing that I probably, as I already kind of said, but the thing that I probably love the most about this book is that it's not just like theology or fiction or anything really just as one particular mode of delivery for the overall message. It's got a bunch of different parables, poetry, personal narrative weaved in there into everything. And so how did you on one side, I want to know, how did you settle on that? How did that work out? And then just like inside baseball question, how'd you sell that to a publisher? That's the question that I've probably got the biggest. I'm like, man, if someone asked me if I wrote this book, what is it? I'd be like, I don't know. Like, you got to read it. That's what I got, man. And I mean that in the best way. But how'd that
yeah.
work
No,
out?
I get it. Well, I can answer the other way around because
Yeah. Yep.
I if for people who care about this boring inside baseball, in the world of nonfiction is kind of strange because most of the time you sell a book before you've written the book. So books are sold based on what's called a pitch or a proposal is the formal term, and you have there's like an industry format for it. You're like, hey, I'm Bob, and I'm so awesome, and I've written this incredible thing, and there's nothing like it in the whole world. It's going to sell 1 billion copies. And so here's the plan. It's going to have chapter 1 is going to explain this, and chapter 2 is going to explain this, all the way up to chapter 10. And if people buy it, they'll be so happy. Please, please,
Yep.
please
Yep.
give me some money.
Yep.
That's how it feels writing these things. I hate them. I hate their guts
Yep.
because you
Yep.
feel like a stupid door-to-door salesman. But all that to say, like you usually haven't you've written an outline because you have to give them one. And a sample chapter is the industry kind of standard where you're like, and this is what it'll sound like. And then you give them a sample, and then the publisher, they look at it and they go, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And it's almost 100% of the time based on, of course, because the industry is an industry and it's in the interest of selling books. So they're like, yeah, that sounds reasonably marketable, and we could probably have an audience for that. And so sure, go write it, and then you sign a contract, you go write the thing, and then you have a deadline, you turn it into them, and then it goes through all the editing process and everything. This is the first book I've written like this. Uh, and ordinarily, even though I'd like to think that my previous nonfiction is a little bit different than standard Christian nonfiction, it is in many ways the same kind of thing you'd expect, which is, like I make some arguments from the Bible and theology to make a point. So in that sense, even though I hope that it's like not dry and boring and sterile, it is essay like, if that makes
Yep.
sense. There's
Yep.
arguments and evidence, and then I make points. And then usually the way that I attempt to keep it from boring the reader to death is by infusing it with some level of unconventional writing along the way. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Crap,
Yep.
putting in stories and language that you might not find in ordinary Christian nonfiction. So that was the plan with this book as well, and that's what I proposed to the publisher, was that I'm going to write a book on discipleship, and it will be kind of essay driven. And I did have a sample chapter that was severely rewritten, but is in the book, and it's a piece of writing called A Short Note on the History of Life and Death, and it's essentially like kind of a narrative summary of the meta narrative of the Bible. So I knew that something like that would be in there. It wasn't like it changed 100%. But as soon as I sat down and tried to start writing the essay version of this book, I was like, this sucks. It's not working. And all I'm doing is emulating better books.
Mm,
I
mm.
could point anyone to Dallas Willard or N.T. Wright and say, here's some great books on discipleship or how to interpret the Sermon on the Mount. Why am I trying to do it? I'm not them, and it doesn't make any sense. And those books already exist, and I'm very happy to
Yep.
give them to people.
Yeah.
And so at some point, like, and I was really fighting it. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Why did I say I could do this? And I knew I wanted there to be a book like this, like a manual on, it's 1 volume and it's a manual on how to be a Christian. Cause people ask me for it all the time and I don't have it.
Absolutely.
Uh, but I couldn't get the stupid voice right. And then at some point, I had a couple of like dares to myself where I was like, what if I could do it without, and this sounds really funny, but like, what if I could do it with no footnotes? Because
Yeah.
footnotes, that means that like you're quoting and referencing other sources and writers. And that's part and parcel of essay writing. And all my other books, I mean, they're overflowing with footnotes. Footnotes are great. But I was like, what if I could do it without footnotes? That would mean that I'm not appealing to someone else's material. I'm just having to put whatever point I want to make in the text itself. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Let me try that. And then I started to think like, what if there's just no essay writing in the whole book? What if instead it's like, it's all either narrative or, like a singular kind of voice that you would find if you found someone's journal, and not like, the professor communicating important information. And that's when I had this idea that was like, I always would hear about certain books that are supposed to be like these really provocative little pieces of illicit literature, like, I don't know, like the Anarchist Cookbook or something
Yep.
like that. If you
Yep.
check it out, you're going to get flagged by the FBI. But then when you
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
look at these books, no offense to the author of the Anarchist
No, no.
Cookbook, they're kind of dull. It's just not what you think it's going to be. It's just like, oh, I thought it would be more interesting than this, or even like, works from someone like Nietzsche, who I quote at the beginning of the book. He's got like a little volume of writing called The Antichrist that I was like, I bet this thing's so crazy and provocative. And you're like, it's just a lot of philosophy. I mean,
Yep.
it's interesting, but like,
Yeah. No,
it's not
absolutely.
the scandalous little handbook that I thought it was going to be. And so I was like, what if I could write that? What if I could write something that was like, it felt like, I was in a monastery library and found this book that was essentially journals written from a season. It was actually Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen
Yeah.
wrote
Yep.
a season of staying at a certain monastery, and he kept a journal the whole time. Uh, and then at some point later, it got published. I don't think the intention was to have it published. And I thought, oh, what an interesting little artifact of writing. It wasn't even meant to be what it turned out to be.
Yep.
And Flannery O'Connor has a prayer journal that was published the same way. And I thought, what if it was something like that? Something that felt like you were getting someone's personal collection of writings that has a purpose, but isn't, like chapter one, I make my point. Chapter two, I tell you what you need to do about it. Chapter
Yep.
three,
Yep.
some inspiration for going forward. You know what I mean? And then when I finally gave it the finished thing, I was like, they're either going to be like, never mind, or they're gonna be like, "Cool, I guess we'll roll with it," and gratefully, it was the latter. It was just like,
Yeah.
"Oh, this is not what we expected, but this is interesting." So,
No, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, no, it is really so good. But I was reading it and I was thinking, man, I've been working on a pitch for my book and I truly don't know how I would pitch this one. Like I can't even conceive. It's great. And to that point, yeah, one of my favorite I really am a fan of Eugene Peterson's works, and one of my favorite books is the one Letters to a Young Pastor, to his son, and it's just emails back and forth between him and his son. And there's such a raw emotion to reading something that it almost feels wrong at times, because you're like, I know I wasn't supposed to read about like something that happened with Becky at his church. Like there's random elements in there. I'm like, they probably should have redacted that. Like, I don't know, I'm sure they changed names or whatever, but like still, like it's kind of crazy, but there's something deep about that. I think it's why I like C.S. Lewis's letters, all of that type of stuff, where you're like, someone didn't really intend for this to be read, and yet I'm reading it. There's just kind of that disarming, unfiltered effect that's in there, and I think your book does a really good job of that as well. So a couple other questions, and I want to be respectful of your time as well, but a couple other questions that I got, but before we start wrapping up, kind of the big one about the book, like about your book. Like I said, one of the things that I really enjoy about it is just it's unflinchingly honest. I think there is something in Joshua's work that is different than a lot of other books, in the sense that it's very polished, but it's not polished in the way that I feel like I'm being tricked into reading something. You just have a very honest way of writing, and I appreciate that. Don't shy away from grit, pain, chaos. The book is I read part of it to my wife as I started reading it, and she was like, "Wow, that is like that's powerful." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm crying like 4 pages into the book." Like even the opening parable about a pastor presumably being at his church and just praying, grateful for how pure he is. Effectively, I was like, "Man, I'm in tears reading this." And in the midst of all of that, how do you hold together like that grit? I think it works really well, but how do you hold the grit together with telling the truth about how hard discipleship can be, while also grounding yourself in the unchanging hope of Jesus?
I mean, honestly, because of the things that are interesting to me aesthetically, lean toward. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm uh, trying to be provocative for the sake of being provocative, though
Sure,
there's a
sure.
certain value in that at times, but like, I think that like what's interesting to me as a reader is something that provokes. And there's lots of ways to provoke the reader, but I think one of them is through the surprise, or maybe a more appropriate word is shock. And it's not difficult to find ways to shock in Christian nonfiction. And I
Yeah.
don't mean that because like, oh, the genre's so boring, it's never
No,
shocking.
no.
You know, like I read Christian nonfiction all day, every day for work. You do too. I mean, like we know that it's just like any other genre of writing. There's a million wonderful things, and then there's a million not so great things. So
Absolutely.
I'm
Yep.
not beating up on it or acting like I'm some kind of pioneer. I just mean that um, any writer, you know this, any writer of something that's like theologically informed or is meant to communicate Christian ideas to probably a primarily Christian audience, hopefully a non-Christian audience as well. Um, you know, it's the same idea as, in any genre, in any form. You know that there are certain things that don't normally happen in that within that genre, and that if you use them, they're going to surprise the reader. And most of the time, there's like a very selective process by which one might avoid those things
Yeah.
or
Yep.
utilize them for a specific reason. And I just see in the teaching of Jesus such um, an unashamed willingness to not just provoke, but at times to alienate the audience,
Yeah.
to divide the audience. And it seems to me that Jesus was often willing to reduce his audience drastically and say things that could have been said a different way and not made anyone offended at all, because the essence of the idea is actually comforting, or it's beautiful, or it's helpful if it's explicit or clearer. And Jesus chooses a communicative form that, you know, I believe is the most intelligent teacher who ever lived. He knows good and well he's going to get everybody ticked off, and he seems to have something in mind when doing it. And I think in my uh, earliest days of writing, and certainly on my worst days now, the immature part of me likes the idea of provoking because it's interesting or fun.
Yep.
And because it is like a cheap effect. It's like it's
Yeah.
the jump scare of Christian writing where you're like, if I put this in there, it's gonna freak people out. But hopefully on my more spirit-led days, um, I'm attempting to, I think, in humility, I'm attempting to, and maybe not always succeeding, but attempting to like, well, how do you provoke in that same kind of spirit as Jesus, in such a way that makes the reader go like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that, and then that sense of being provoked leads to a moment of almost immediate reflection, self-reflection. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And the parable that you've mentioned is a great one. As because at some point I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to adapt the major parables of Jesus because they're all so fascinating, and most of them are like over the top or bizarre. Some of them are like violent or really bleak sounding. And the parable of the, you know, the Pharisee and the publican, or the Pharisee and the tax collector, however it's worded, is just so, in his language, is so simple. It's just like you got the one guy who's like, I do this, and thank God I'm not like this other guy.
Yep.
And then the other guy, you know, is just like, oh God, have mercy on me. Um, and some of these stories are so, again, so deeply familiar to the Christian imagination that just a slight reworking of the
Yeah.
context, you know, like setting it in a modern setting, or just telling it through a different character's vantage, uh, it makes it jarring all over again without recasting any of the major ideas or anything, you know. And of course, I would never presume to like update or improve
No, no,
upon
no.
the
Yep.
teaching of Jesus. It's just like, what if it was the same story just from this angle for the sake of your imagination? What would that look like? And then Jesus does all the work for you. I mean, like all I've done is just retell the essence of those parables, recontextualize it from a different person's perspective. And I think that those points, you know, they give you an excuse to use that like that grittiness that you're talking about. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's just there in the text already,
Yeah.
and hopefully provokes the reader the way it was intended to provoke the original audience. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Well, like the familiarity with the stories already, I think is the piece that just kind of shocks out of you in a good way reading through this book, where I'm sitting there and I'm like, I have read the Genesis account a million times. Like I've preached through it 15 times at least. Like I know the story. If you ask me to recount the story, I can do it. But then there's something about reading it and just kind of just those slight changes where it's not, yeah, in no way is it improving upon God's word in any way. I didn't think that's the case, the attempt there, but it does kind of like shake up, especially for someone in my context, been in church for
Yeah.
almost 30 years. Like it's just part
Yeah,
of
you're
life.
living
And I'm like,
in the office every day.
yeah, exactly. I'm like, okay, cool. And then you read it and you're like, oh my gosh, like God, there it is again. Like I'm grateful for that. That's for sure. So yeah, I think the last question that I've got for you, we'll get back on the book train with other books. And the last question I've got is probably my favorite to ask everybody, but it is, if you could put one book in the hands of every Christian right now, what book would it be?
Oh man,
Yeah,
every Christian. Oh geez, I
yeah,
should have
yeah.
prepared.
It's it's a tough one, man. But but yeah,
Well, okay, I'll answer without trying to come up with something that sounds really smart.
sure, sure.
I think my first reflex is it has to be fiction. Because I encourage the people of my church all the time. It's like I think all Christians should read fiction, because if you don't, you really struggle to make sense of the Bible, which is not fiction, but includes fiction, and it includes so many different genres of writing and so many different kinds of like really over the top or offensive or grotesque bits of writing, along with all the beautiful redemptive. And there's stuff that's like really clear and concise, and then there's stuff that's really cryptic and really opaque. And that's all those things are what good fiction does really well. And so people with no literary experience approach the scriptures, which are the most sophisticated work of literary, masterpiece, in the history of the world, and they want to read it like a manual. They want to read it like a theological encyclopedia,
Basic
and then
instructions before leaving
yeah,
Earth. Yeah,
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 as if
been
it's
there.
this like it translates to life in the modern world instantly and with no contextual or interpretive work whatsoever. And then they become understandably frustrated when the Bible just won't do that for them. And then other people come along and suggest that there's a literary way to understand the scriptures, and they think that that means not true. Like if you say that the Bible is a work of literary sophistication, that I'm implying that it's a storybook and nothing else. And that to me is indicative of the big problem that we don't know how to read the scriptures. That's a whole other conversation, but I think that one component of improving on the literary imagination of the Christian is just reading more fiction.
Yep. Yep.
That so much of the world's fiction, and to say nothing of lyricism or film, I mean, so much of it is informed by the scriptures anyway. There's so many, I mean, and not to put the Bible on the level of, but in the same way that a lot of literature is informed by or influenced by something like the Odyssey or
Oh yeah,
Dante, like the
absolutely.
scriptures and the ideas in the Bible, or even the narrative conceits in the Bible, echo throughout all ancient, all and modern storytelling. And so it can be really helpful to unlock the imagination of the Christian.
Absolutely.
Um, and then there's a couple of books that have come to mind, and this is the one I'll land on. Like there was a period when I invited everyone on my church planting team a decade ago to read a novel by Michael Faber. He wrote a book called "The Book of Strange New Things,"
Okay.
and it's a science fiction novel from recent memory. It might be like 10 years old or something like
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
in which a British pastor is relocated on a missionary journey to another planet.
Yeah.
And he is going to become the first chaplain to an unreached people group, and they're
Wow.
aliens.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
sounds like a, goofy in premise, but it's a very literary work, and it's not like Dune or something.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like
Yep.
Dune, to be clear, not beating up on Dune,
Sure.
but
Sure.
it's not high science fiction. It's like contemporary literature. Anyway, the experience that this dude has separated from his wife and in a different place and trying to connect with his purpose in life becomes like a really powerful meditation on like the vocation of the Christian, the mission and purpose of the gospel, and examines things in a way that's like kind of tragic and convicting, but also fascinating. And I was really affected by it the first time I read it. It was one of those books that we were talking about earlier, where you're hoping it's going to be amazing, and that one to me concluded, and I was like really shook by it. And so I started to give it copies of it to my church planting team and said, "Read this." It's
Yeah.
a little bit like, you mentioned Eugene Peterson earlier, and he has, his book, The Pastor, which is a collection of writings about the journey of pastoral work. And it kind of is similar in that tradition of like a meditation on what it means to live into your calling and for other people
Yeah.
as someone who's broken, and in the face of suffering and sin. So yeah, I mean, I think the Book of Strange New Things. It's not like the work that changed my life,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
I think that I would pick something that's fiction, and I would pick something like that, something that's like it is on the surface a book about God. I don't know if Michael Faber's a Christian. It's like one of those things where you read
Yeah.
and you're like, is this dude a Christian?
Yeah. Yeah.
If he's at very least theologically educated, and I don't know what his agenda is, and I liked that about it. I
Yeah.
found the ideas in it to be consistent with script, like and true, but it wasn't really important that his
Yeah.
worldview or agenda were necessarily Christian. It was just like the story itself was powerful and provocative.
That's cool. No, I legitimately think that half of doing this show is just so I can find more books that I've got to read. So that'll definitely be one added to my list. So I
Yeah, if
appreciate
you
it,
get
man.
to it, let me know what you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. That sounds good. Yeah, I honestly, I think I spent the first, I guess, 7 years of pastoral ministry. I spent just reading nonfiction because like you're going through college classes, seminary, and everything pretty much that's ascribed to you. Definitely at my school was nonfiction, and that's just kind of what you've got. And then you get into ministry, and everybody comes up and they're like, "Hey, read this book," and I read this one. I want to do it for Bible study. What's your thoughts? And so I spent like 7 years reading some books I really enjoyed that were nonfiction Christian stuff, and a lot of books that I really did not enjoy, but people told me they were going to use as a Bible study. And I was like, I'm not sure that I love that. Let me
Yeah.
read it so I can get back
Yep.
to you. Like, let's find
Yep.
out. And kind of lost some of the passion I once had for reading because of that. Not that it's bad. I really do still, the majority of what I read is nonfiction Christian stuff. And I love some of it, but yeah, I guess a couple years ago, about 3-4 years ago now, got back into reading fiction and was like, whoa, this is just to what you were saying about reading scripture with that lens. Like, I know that it's cognitively something I'm aware of, but then when you get out of practice of reading fiction, reading other genres, you're like, oh man, I remember how good this is and how much more beneficial this is for my reading of scripture. I always tell people, I'm like, dude, if you haven't read Dante's Inferno, you have to read, especially as a Christian, just on the grounds that so much of what we see in our minds as we read the Bible that describes hell and demonic and all of that stuff, so much of it's so shaped by this. Even if you've never read the book, it's what you've been taught, probably shaped by Dante's Inferno. So go read it, like, find out.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's accurate. I'm just saying at least then you
Yeah,
know
it's
where it
banana
came
and it's
from.
bananas. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. Even on,
Absolutely.
like, in terms of, like, how over the top really old
Yep.
Italian writing can get. It's like, there's some really gross, weird stuff in this book.
Absolutely so. Yes, yeah. But I'm like, it helps the Christian imagination, which I think is something that unfortunately the church has lacked a little bit of in recent years. And I'm hoping that I think there's some glimmers of some pockets of that popping up that I'm really appreciative of. So all that to say,
Yeah, for sure.
thank you. Appreciate you so much for coming on here. Definitely, if you're listening along with us, check out Josh's books. The new one, like I said earlier, How to Die, right here. Incredible book. I've got my physical copy of With All Its Teeth over here. Check that one out as well. I know I read Death to Deconstruction. I think I got it on Audible, so I don't have that. I at least can't find my physical copy somewhere in here. So maybe I
I'll
listen
let
to
it
it.
slide, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. But and then I know you've got fiction work. If I've got it off the top of my head, so I know there was punk rock versus the lizard people, if I
That's right, yeah.
remember right. And then the Great Georgia Dirt Dragon, if I'm
That's
correct. I
right, yeah.
have not read that one yet. I've got to get it, but have not gotten into it yet. But go ahead, check those
If
out.
you get around to it, let me know what you think, yeah.
Dude, I promise you I will. I got you, man. No, I appreciate you. Is there anywhere that listeners can connect with you afterwards? Website, internet, all that stuff?
Yeah, everything is, joshuasporter.com. So anything that you wanna find out is at least there or linked there if you're the internet type.
Sweet. I appreciate it, man. Well, I definitely encourage you guys, go check that out. Thank you for being on the show. Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Yeah, dude.
But
Thanks for having me.
of course.